bring up lying, as we mentioned just lying, because this is what I mentioned to you before, privately. And that is the situation of World War II, when there were forged documents to save Jews from the Nazis.
Right.
So it's alleged, I'm not sure how much Pius XII signed off on this personally, but it was certainly done in his name, as I understand it, in Rome after the Nazis took Rome. They forged documents that were baptismal certificates for all these Jews to save them from the Nazis. Can you break down, why is lying intrinsically evil? What is sort of an allowed mental reservation? And then how do you evaluate these sort of instances of fraud in World War II?
Yeah, it's well, first of all, Prumer tends to follow the Thomistic understanding about lying, which is basically, St. Thomas says in the Summa, which is, again, you see this in the moral theology text after him, that basically what it boils down to is that if you look at the nature of the faculty of speech, it's ultimately designed to convey the truth which is known in the intellect. So that's its structure by the natural law, that it's its design. It's not designed to say something contrary to what's in our intellect. It's actually designed to speak what is truly in our intellect. So in lying, St. Thomas says, is that it's actually contrary to the natural law because it's against the very nature of speech to say something that is contrary to what we know is true. In other words, it's contrary to the very way that God structured us to think and to speak. So that being the case, what happens is that anytime we lie, so the definition of a lie is saying the false in order to deceive. So it's the saying of the false, St. Thomas says. The deception, you can actually have deception under certain circumstances which could be morally justified. So if you have a justifying condition, then technically speaking, deceiving somebody is not necessarily bad. So for example, in mental reservation, which you just mentioned, you're actually in a true mental reservation, you're actually saying something that's materially true. So if somebody comes and says, do you have any Jews in this house? And I say, I don't have any here, referring to the porch, right? It's one of the examples that's often given. Is you're saying what's materially true. I don't have any Jews on the porch, right? And the deception is justified because St. Thomas says the falsity in the person's intellect is a natural evil. But the natural evil, and normally if you don't have a justifying condition, that's bad, right? But if you have a justifying condition, the fact that the person suffers that natural evil is the result ultimately of their own disorder. So in the end, in this particular case, because they're trying to kill the Jews, in that particular case, you would have the deception would actually be justified morally because of the fact that there's a proportion between that and what you're trying to do, which is save the lives of the Jews. So in that particular case, it's not the deception where the problem is. The deception, the real problem, so deception can be either justified or non-justified. The real problem is whether you're saying something that's true or not. So he says you can't, in mental reservations, he actually uses a different term. The mental reservation is the term that the Jesuits gave to it later, which is the legitimate use. But St. Thomas calls it simulation versus dissimulation. Simulation is when you actually do something or say something which is false in order to deceive, whereas dissimulation is when you actually say the true in order to deceive. And he said dissimulation, saying, because which he gets that term from Saint Augustine, dissimulation. He says dissimulation can be justified if the deception, there's a proportionate reason for the deception. So in that particular case, then you can say something that's true to deceive somebody if you have a legitimate reason. So I tell teenagers, for example, you don't have a legitimate reason to lie to your parents or to deceive your parents, right? If they're asking where you're going, you have to tell them the truth. But on this particular case, and you could legitimately deceive the Nazis in order to keep them from killing the Jews, because obviously the life of the Jews is proportionate to this guy having falsity. So in his intellect, you just can't say what's materially false, because if you do that, then it's abusive of your faculty of speech. And that's why St. Thomas says the moral tradition pretty much follows that. Prumer tends to follow that. And that's why lying was never considered justified, because it's always considered abusive of the faculty based on the natural law of what our intellect and faculty of speech was designed to do. And so that's why, for example, in the case of some people do ask me that from time to time, but what about the fact that they were forging documents? Technically speaking, that's not lying. It's actually a form of fraud. So the difference is that lying is you say the false in order to deceive, whereas fraud is you do the false in order to deceive. And so this is a case of which you're falsifying documents. In a relationship to the Vatican doing it before, I mean, I can understand the intention behind it, but this is again a case of where the ends don't justify the means. And I suspect that it was I mean, I've studied it to some degree. It is hard to know exactly how much Pius XII actually knew and whether he signed off on it or whether he just signed off on it generically, like do whatever you need to do to save these people. It could have been something like that. And then from that, they said, well, he said it was okay, kind of thing. But anyway, that being said, I'm one of those people that tends to think that they did actually commit moral evils in this particular case, and they should not have done it. I think they should have been a little bit more creative and figured out other ways to try and deceive the Nazis in relationship to these things. Maybe it's to put out certain kinds of documentation where the documentation is actually true, but the Nazis would easily be deceived, that type of thing.
Okay, excellent. So are you alluding to are there good moralists out there who would justify this fraud and say that it was a proportionate, you could do evil, but you couldn't say evil in this case? Is that an opinion out there?
I'll be honest with you. The only guys that tend to justify this type of stuff are the ones who either don't follow the natural law or they don't accept that this faculty of speech is structured by the natural law, or that they're kind of squeamish and they don't want to think that maybe some Jews would die because you were telling the truth, everything. So I think there's some guys. I mean, I think there's a difference between a good moralist who's good by intention. I think there's a lot of those guys out there that would say, well, it was justified. But if you're talking about a good moralist in the sense of someone who's adhering to the moral principles, they all tend to fall upon the idea that no, there was disorder being done there, and that there should have been some other method, but that should have been derived.